If you're like me, you've always wanted to sketch more while traveling, but often came home with fewer drawings than hoped for, or maybe struggled finding the ideal setup. Especially for a busy city like Seoul, I wanted to explore different convenient sketchbook options and optimize my travel palette. In spring, I had 2 short trips to Seoul coming up and wanted to get back into travel sketching for those. While going on these 2 trips, one with family, one by myself, I learned a lot, made even more mistakes, found a travel palette and other tools I love, and explored some artsy corners of Seoul to visit galleries, sketch at the palace, and be inspired by museums. I hope you enjoy this sketchbook-focused tour of Seoul, and some of the lessons I learned are helpful for you, too. This small travel sketchbook has been neglected since 2020, mostly showing local views and the occasional color study, so this should also revive my sketchbook habit, I hope. To get back into the swing of things, I had to familiarize myself with my color palette. I'd been using watercolors for years before switching to acrylics a couple years ago. I'd also borrowed a few splotches of gouache paint from a friend. This quite unusual combination of moss green and a muted lavender. So my DIY travel palette would use a combination of watercolors and gouache, using what I already had at home, but also taking advantage of gouache paints. Those are semi-opaque to truly opaque and need less water to activate, so I find them easier to handle for quick, unplanned paintings in cramped locations. I used a line drawing I'd sketched while hiking for practice. When traveling around Jeju, I often sketch just line drawings and then take a corresponding picture to have a rough color reference for later. That way, even if my time is limited, I can take a piece of a location with me. Immediately when I started using my single white poster color, I knew that including gouache paints would make travel sketching so much easier. It's so much fun to have this opaque color layer to add details and highlights. What are your favorite travel sketching supplies? Since I usually paint with acrylics, those dry out too fast for on-the-go paintings, but this combination of gouache and watercolors feels really promising. By the way, this travel palette showed up in an earlier art vlog of mine, where I made the pans out of air-dry clay and used glue and magnets to add them to this metal case. Since Seoul can be hectic, I want to go as minimal and safe as possible, and hopefully the paints will stay put. One reason I often fell out of the habit of travel sketching in the past was the time commitment, so for this trip I wanted to have an even simpler sketching option with me. I used this tiny craft paper pad that fits into my jeans pockets and even the smallest handbag, together with pens. Of course, these tiny drawings are no masterpieces, but I loved sketching travelers at the airport, the decor of cafes, museum exhibits, and kept a simple visual diary this way, with little notes and location names all throughout the trip. For a city trip like Seoul, I found that going this small was key. This tiny sketchpad and a single black pen were my constant companions. I kept using the graph paper sketchbook for post-studies on all these long metro rides we went on, from Iwa to Yongsan, from Gangnam's Starfield Library to Hongdae's art supply shop. Since I mentioned the art shop, this large art supply store in Hongdae, Homi was what I beelined for on that first afternoon as I waited for my parents' delayed flight to arrive from Europe. I already knew I wanted to slowly add more gouache paints to my collection, and since the Homi Art Shop has so many different brands of colored pencils that they sell as single colors, I also got a few shades of the Derwent Light Fast to try out, together with the paint's grey shade of Garandash Luminance I'd heard a lot of good things about. Since I was traveling with my parents, in between enjoying our time together, sightseeing more than I would on my own, and me looking up restaurants, connecting bus lines, museum opening hours, and translating, there was just generally less time for art. Travel sketches can look different for every artist, but also different for each trip. My goal on this city trip was to stay creative, to enjoy drawing and sketching without any pressure, to test out my new gouache paints. But if I were traveling to a quiet countryside location instead, my plans might have looked very different, aiming for larger landscape studies, for example. A trip can be treated as an art retreat, a break from daily life that lets us dive into drawing, or the art can just be our companion on a regular vacation. If you're traveling in a group, plan for less time spent drawing than you expect. Even just setup can take a moment, and sketches often take longer than one might think. My color palette was very muted, with the soft green and purple gouache paint I'd borrowed, the new ash gray, which turned out amazing for quick building paintings, and burnt umber. So while I want to add a couple primary colors to my collection, it actually suited this overcast morning view I sketched at a cafe. I also bought a water brush, as there's just no way to fit a water cup on a small cafe table without ending up drinking it by accident. I especially treasure the small drawings showing my parents sitting opposite me on one long ride. If you ever felt overwhelmed by travel sketches, I really recommend a similarly tiny sketchbook for a stress-free, easing sketching experience. Going small, just having fun and being creative, seeing the world as an artist and looking for that magic that makes us want to create, even if it's just a doodle. Small sketches on the go keep me in the flow and can make for beautiful physical memories. This kept my mind in a state of looking for inspiration, of being open to creative impulses, and made the idea of travel sketching less daunting. To enjoy a trip creatively, not all sketches have to be painted right there and then. I loved finding inspiration at the National Museum and in the park surrounding it, in Yongsan. And while I only drew a few pen sketches of some of the exhibit items there on the spot, the pictures I took made for amazing references once I returned home. All the gold jewelry, weaponry and regalia at the museum especially inspired several paintings of Korean mythology with gold leaf embellishing that I worked on when we got home. This is why I wanted my travel sketchbook to be pressure-free. It left room to let the environment sink in, to absorb the beauty around me and let all that simmer until I had time to express it properly and do it justice. Once I returned from that first trip, I went about updating my travel palette with a larger metal case to fit all my magnetic DIY watercolor pens. For travel sketching, you can of course use any material you enjoy. I think I'd love to give other media a try if I go on a calmer, extended vacation, but for these short trips and for traveling in a busy city, I love the simplicity of just pencils, colored pencil and gouache. While I still have some watercolors in my palette, it's mostly to tide me over until I commit to more gouache paints. Watercolors just work better with more absorbent brushes using wet-on-wet techniques and generally need more water and longer drying times. With gouache, I can layer lighter paints over dark ones, which comes in very helpful when adjusting values while sketching. Even if you only use watercolors for travel sketching, I'd recommend bringing along a single white poster color or gouache paint, as it really helped me with small adjustments of values, especially if the sunlight changed dramatically. I also used rainbow pencils, something I've been obsessed with lately, to draw the outlines to add more vibrancy and color variation. A few weeks later I had to head back, this time to visit my in-laws and drop off my art in time for a small gallery group exhibit. As these mythology paintings were inspired by my previous trip to Seoul and the museum there, it felt fitting to combine the two trips into one travel sketchbook video. Now my rhythm changed on this trip. I was traveling alone and planned for time spent at cafes and outdoors, just sketching. The weather was also much nicer, and even just on the way to the gallery after my flight had landed, I took some pictures for inspiration to later paint at a cafe. This time I came prepared with a proper sturdy brush case. While I love the water brush for those early water-based color layers, switching to a regular brush for more opaque gouache layers after that works amazingly, and I really enjoyed the combination. As you can see, I decided to not use pen outlines this time. That's what I always gravitate towards when doing urban sketching of any kind, but I think it's become a bit of a crutch and I want to practice a more color-focused, shape-focused approach. I'm slowly adding more contrast. Since I'm used to those pen outlines, I had to push myself to go darker with the color values here to create the contrast and sharpness that the pen usually takes care of. This is a step out of my comfort zone, and the rainbow pencils made the transition a bit easier, the sketch disappearing into the gouache and watercolors, but giving me that first helpful guide. The second day of this trip was a family day, though I did meet a friend for coffee and strolling around the Hapjeong and Hongdae area in the afternoon. I only brought this tiny sketchbook from Hanemühle and a bunch of pencils and colored pencils with me. Now, I'm not sure if I can actually call these travel sketches. They had nothing to do with my surroundings, but they were done while traveling, after all. The lead up to this trip had been incredibly hectic when it came to client work, so I was excited to have free time for some good old drawing practice. I want to improve my values when drawing, so here I used the full range from the white of the paper to the near complete black of the Garandage Luminance colored pencils. I'd also grabbed 3 more gouache paints at the art shop: yellow ochre, flame red and ivory black. The next day I went to Gwanghwamun and Gyeongbokgung Palace, and I was in a rush to catch the 11 AM change of guards at Gyeongbokgung. As someone who loves historical settings and medieval fantasy of all kinds, I loved seeing the armor and clothing, the weapons and flags demonstrated here, and they might show up in a future fantasy illustration with a Korean influence. The palace's main area was absolutely packed, as can be expected on a sunny weekend morning, and since I'd visited the main hall in the past, the park and smaller buildings surrounding it were more appealing. If you plan on visiting Gyeongbokgung Palace, make sure to leave enough time for the smaller buildings and nature around it too. For travel sketching, I'd planned an hour or 2 of time before I had to move again to nearby Insadong, and I soon found this perfect spot in the shade at a pond with this pavilion. It's a bit embarrassing to realize that this is now only the second on-location proper travel sketch in this video, with the previous one just a view from a cafe's window. I was surprised how quickly this sketchbook session went by. The watercolor layer was done quickly as I forced myself to take a loose, rough approach and then slowly added contrast and details with gouache. It's strange how much I love the feeling of sketching on location, yet end up doing it so rarely. Do you do a lot of plein air sketching? Do you have any advice for making it a consistent habit? I always end up at a cafe instead, sitting at windows with a nice view, but there's something so inspiring about the immediacy of this. From Gyeongbokgung it was a short walk to the main street of Insadong, which was a positive surprise. Insadong might be touristy, but it's popular for a reason, and I enjoyed not having to avoid cars barreling down the street for once. While I'd seen some beautiful street views and city panoramas over the last couple days, Seoul's sidewalks are small and incredibly busy, and I never felt comfortable setting up somewhere and getting in the way of all the passers-by and stray mopeds. I think if you're travel sketching in a cozy small town, this would feel very different, but for large cities, there's a bit more planning involved. In my memories, Insadong had only souvenir shops and the usual chains and brands. There were a lot of small galleries to visit, even smaller art shops with traditional painting and calligraphy supplies, and a wonderful art shop where I bought a few more colored pencils in various shades of grey. We grabbed coffee and later dessert at a vegan bakery before heading to the gallery opening at East Atelier Gallery. I have to admit I felt a bit out of my element, as most artists here are from the Seoul area, and it was my first time joining in a group exhibit in the city. All the paintings and sculptures on display were so inspiring, and it was even more inspiring to talk to the other artists. Sometimes I wish I lived closer to Seoul to visit events like this more often, to join artist meetups and sketchbook clubs in the city, but then when I returned to Jeju-do, I love the quiet of the countryside as well. While my first trip had been focused on getting into a travel sketching habit, the second trip focused on learning new techniques and improving my paintings. I loved both experiences and all the different options I now have at my disposal. At the airport, I finished up my Lord of the Rings scene while waiting. This sketchbook by Hanemura is a bit larger than my craft sketchpad, but still small enough for these sketches to stay quick and simple. While I didn't create a large amount of art on these 2 short trips, I do feel like I learned much, explored different options to find what interests me, and what works for busy, hectic city sketching, as well as calmer outdoor locations. The tiny pen drawings got me into the habit of reaching for pen and sketchpad instead of my phone while on metro rides, and I fell in love with gouache paints beyond adding final details to watercolor paintings. So I'm really very happy with the art I finished, the little sketches as memories, the drawing practice, and excited for more travel sketching in the future. I hope I was able to show you some beautiful corners of Seoul as well, and that you enjoyed watching me learn something new, even if I made mistakes along the way. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in future art videos.